Welcome back to a weekend agenda. Joining me now in the studio is our regular Sunday political panel this afternoon. Very pleased to welcome Labor MP for Hotham, Claire O'Neill, and her fellow Melbourne MP, but Liberal and member for Goldstein.
Neighbouring seat, in fact.
Neighbouring seat, Tim Wilson. But first of all, Claire, congratulations. Young Louis, now 9 weeks old and about to make his first trip to Canberra. That's going to be a challenge.
Exactly. Well, he'll be making his Canberra debut in our next sitting week, which is coming up in about 10 days. And he's told me he's very excited about Prime Minister meeting Bill Shorten. So, no, it's something we're looking forward to.
Now, good on you. And first of all, let's get on to this asylum seeker deal announced by the Prime Minister today. Interestingly enough, does not involve the government's lifetime ban legislation on people from Nauru and Manus visiting Australia. That'd have to be a huge relief for the Labor Party, because that would have really divided Labor in a way that this deal has not. Enthusiastic support from Bill Shorten.
Yeah. Well, the bill that went to Parliament trying to put a lifetime ban on these people coming to Australia ever was probably one of the most pathetic attempts to wedge Labor that I've seen, and an unsuccessful one too in the time that I've been in Parliament. There was no policy reason for this. There was no one in the community calling for it, and like much of what the Coalition does, it really came out of nowhere. We were told at one point that this might be a contingency on the deal to get people off Nauru and Manus Island, but it appears that we were misled on that. So there's nothing in that's been said by the Secretary of State, Joe Biden, that suggests that that's the case.
John Kerry.
No, John Kerry, sorry. Yeah, and so very disappointing to see the Coalition going down this path again.
Tim, you would obviously say the opposite about this, but if it was not in some way related to what the government is now doing, either with the United States or possibly with other countries, maybe Malaysia, maybe Indonesia, maybe New Zealand, although New Zealand rejects the idea of two classes of citizens already, and therefore their offer of 150 to be taken from Nauru and Manus is currently in limbo. But if it's not for that, what on earth is it about?
Well, what it's about is making a very clear statement to people smugglers about if people want to to come to Australia, they have to go through the ordinary channels. And if you have a situation where people enter Indonesia and they think that because of this deal or because of other arrangements that will eventually be secured by the government, they can somehow find a way to get to Australia and that it will be cost-free, that is simply not the case. And that's why the government has taken such a strong position. I mean, I'm not going to try and pretend that I haven't thought about this very deeply with my human rights background, but if this delivers better human outcomes and security for people to be able to make decisions, get resettled and move on with their lives, it has an important role to play. And that's why it's very disappointing that Labor isn't actually going to support the legislation, or is still to sort of finalise exactly where it's going to end up, particularly in light of this deal, because this deal around making sure that we can resettle people in the United States is not just a huge victory for the government, it's an enormous outcome for people, the people who are on Manus Island and Nauru, to give them a pathway to be able to go and live their lives if they've been assessed as legitimate refugees, and we should be celebrating that.
Could I just ask,
go ahead.
Is this legislation related in any way to the deal with the US? Has the US asked the Australian government to put this in place? Because that was what was implied.
Claire, you know I'm not the Minister for Immigration. I haven't been engaged in those negotiations as much as I'd love to think of my standing. But when it comes down to it, there are people on Manus Island, Nauru, and they have to make decisions. They have been misled at different times by asylum seeker advocates or what they've seen on the television based on Labor's policy positions on this issue, that if they just hold out and they just wait, they're going to be able to come and resettle in Australia. The objective of this piece of legislation is to make it abundantly clear that is not the option on the table. So they have to look at alternative options, including now either being resettled in the US, or if they're not assessed to be legitimate refugees, which is the case in a certain number of circumstances, that they either have to find a third country and or need to return home, because asylum should be based, or granting of asylum should be based on the legitimacy of an application, not the method of your arrival.
Claire O'Neill, there is a point here, is there not? The government is clearly very worried about the possibility this will reignite the people smuggling trade and possibly lead to more deaths at sea. Paris Aristotle had on before the break, respected individual in regard to this whole business, and he says, yes, it is a real worry. There is a real concern and a real likelihood that as a consequence of this, the people smugglers will have something more to sell. So why not have something, even if it is more rhetorical than real, as yet another reason why people should be in no doubt that they won't, if they go to Nauru or Manus, they're not coming here.
Well, no one's been able to furnish any evidence whatsoever that that's the case, Jim, the way that you've framed that.
Well, hang on, you've got respected asylum seeker advocates
Tim,
now starting to say that there is a real risk. I don't think you can dismiss
Tim,
it.
If you listen to my points, then perhaps we'll get to that. Of course, we don't want to see the people trade start up again. But the critical thing here is that you've got the two main political parties in Australia who have a bipartisan commitment to making sure that that trade, which is basically a trade in human misery, the lowest thing that you could do to people who are refugees, doesn't start up again. But no one's been able to prove that this piece of legislation has got anything to do with the push and pull factors that determine whether people try to seek refuge in Australia. And I think the message has been pretty clearly heard that if you come to Australia by boat, you're not going to end up being settled here. People have been living on Manus Island and Nauru essentially indefinitely until this recent incident, and no one's been able to show that there's any indication that people believe they're going to be settled in Australia.
Tim Wilson?
Well, firstly, that's false. I mean, when it comes down to it, there are a lot of people who have not taken alternative options precisely because they feel, both because of Labor's division on this issue, but also because they have been misled by some asylum seeker advocates that they think that they will, if they hold out long enough, they will be able to resettle in this country. Now, seeking asylum and being granted refugee status is not an entitlement to pick the country that you end up in. It is an entitlement to be free of persecution. And so long as people can be resettled elsewhere, we have fulfilled our obligations and our commitments to those people. And one of the things we have to be clear about is that there is a risk that people will come. There are people in Indonesia. They do want to come to Australia. They are seeking to arrive by boat. And any point of division where they feel any confidence that they will be able to get through, regardless of the route and the process, diminishes the risk of having border security and people arriving by boat.
The reason that there are so many people still on Manus Island and Nauru is because all that this government did to try to get them off was sign a $55 million deal with Cambodia that has settled one person from Manus Island and Nauru.
But that's exactly the point, and this is where your rhetoric is false or based on false understanding, because they have thought that if they stay on Manus Island and Nauru and they just sit there and wait, that they will eventually be resettled in Australia. So while you might have some difficulty with the pieces of legislation, in practice, it is very important to make sure that people know that they have to take their options because otherwise they're going to stay there.
Yeah, there's absolutely, this is crazy. You're talking about a deal that might see these people become US citizens. And you're saying to them that it's going to make a difference that you tell them that when you're a US citizen, you'll never be able to come to Australia to work, to come as a tourist in 20 years' time. It's ridiculous. It has no policy impact. And the only reason that you are doing this is because you are trying to create a little bit of distraction and a bit of division in the Labor Party. And it's just hopeless. It's pathetic. And it just shows that, unfortunately, your government has nothing better to do than to play silly wedge politics instead of actually running the country.
Claire, I know that might sound cute inside the Labor Party caucus, running those narratives and lines, but the practice is there is a very serious issue. And this is the sort of dismissive attitude that has led to a situation where you had thousands of people arrive by boats when you watered down the laws last time. You then put children in detention. Our job has been to fix it up, to solve it, both to stop the boats, to then get children out of detention. As someone who worked as part of the inquiry to try and stop that and to make sure that kids could get out. And now we're trying to fix up the mess finally by getting people off Manus Island and Nauru. And your response to it is just to run talking points. This is people's lives on the line.
Oh, please.
Well, I'm sorry, you can
dismiss
and much that.
And Tim,
when people have a choice about what they're going to do.
Your party has been in government now for 3 years, and you've done almost nothing about this until now.
Well,
people on Nauru and Manus Island,
fundamentally
people on Manus Island and Nauru have self-immolated. Someone's been beaten to death by a security guard, and here you are so smugly talking about what a brilliant job you've done.
Well,
and can I just say, please don't ever say something I say is cute again.
Well, with respect, it's a line and it's not based on evidence or reason or what's actually occurring. When we've had to have inquiries based on the system that has been set up by yourself, by the Labor Party, and had to undo the mess, that is the situation we now face. The reality is, there were children in detention when we arrived in government. Our role in government has been to get them out. We're now getting them out of Manus Island and Nauru, and you're sitting there laughing about it.
No,
These
I'm not
are people's lives. Well, you are laughing about it. You're not taking it seriously. This is very serious policy.
This is outrageous.
Well, it might be outrageous, but when it comes down to it,
one last
this
word
is the
each, then we've got to move
situation
on.
we face.
Claire O'Neill.
Well, I just think this is a completely ludicrous attempt to play politics, and it is an important issue, and if only we could actually debate this as human beings instead of you trying to wedge us as your primary policy function here, I think we would have solved this problem a long time ago.
We are not trying to wedge, we are trying to actually solve the problem. The reality is if we had adopted Labor's policies on these issues, boats would still be arriving, people would still be going to detention, children would still be in detention, and you can dismiss it as much as you want. That's exactly the same attitude Kevin Rudd took when he was in the leadership position, which has led to this disastrous human condition.
Tim, Claire, better leave it there. I'd like to move on to the US election and the fallout from it. A year ago, you and Tim Watts wrote a book, Two Futures, in which you worried about the future of democracy in Australia and, by implication, the rest of the world too, concerned about things like housing affordability for the young, questions about equity and so on and so forth. Do you think some of that was reflected in the US election, and also the fact that if you look at the demographics and take away whether it was voting for Hillary Clinton or voting for Donald Trump, that the young voted in fewer numbers than they have in the past?
Well, I think there's definitely potential to see some of what we observed in the US election reflected here in Australia, though there is an important caveat, and that is that the economic situation in the US is quite different to what we see here. So over the last generation, both countries have grown their economies significantly, but in Australia, we've seen that growth much more fairly shared. So households that have been on low incomes have seen those incomes grow, whereas in the US we've seen a lot of stagnation in those households, and a lot of those people ended up voting for Trump, voting Republican for the first time in a long time. But what we do see in Australia is very clearly a lot of people disengaging from politics, disengaging from our political process. So just about any indicator that we might like to look at shows us that people have less faith than ever in people like Tim and I to properly represent their views. Unfortunately, Jim, even you come into the gun with the media.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, no,
fair cop.
A recent survey suggested that only 6% of Australians feel very confident that the federal parliament is acting in their best interests, and that's obviously something that would concern Tim, concern everyone in politics. Your point about young people, though, is a really good one. In the 2013 federal election, about 400,000 young people didn't vote in that election simply because they never bothered to get themselves on the electoral roll. Now, the last election, 400,000 people, that's 4 federal electorates. They could have changed who the government is in this country. But I think what it shows is that we're not doing a good enough job at showing young people, at showing people who are a bit disengaged from politics, that they've got a stake in this process and it's something that they can influence.
Is it a question of civics? Do you agree at least with that from Claire O'Neill, that there is more work that needs to be done to engage people of your age and younger in the political process, that they do feel detached and that they don't think that democracy is really as important and takes eternal vigilance to look at your poppy, for example?
Well, I think we've got to be careful about drawing too many comparisons between the US and Australia. There are parallels. I'm not trying to dismiss it. But in America, you have completely gerrymandered districts, so who people vote for can often have no consequence to the final outcome. People aren't seeing the Congress working successfully. It's not just about the presidency. Australia risks having similar issues emerge when the Senate won't work constructively with the government so that they can see that democracy can achieve outcomes, can actually improve the human condition, can actually improve the direction of the country. But when we have political paralysis because we have simply partisan politicking, when you've got a substantial victory for human outcomes today on the table, and I think everybody's broadly acknowledging it in the area of asylum seeker policy. The challenge is for the parliament to work and to try and drive that sort of reform through rather than just to nitpick or partisan politic. And that goes across the board. That's where you get young people realising that democracy can still achieve outcomes rather than dismissing and not engaging entirely.
Tim, Claire, unfortunately, we could talk about this subject for a very long time, and I hope sometime in the future we will again, because I think it's really important indeed. And I don't want to draw too many parallels between the United States and Australia, but there are some there very generally. Also, thank you very much for the spirit in which you engaged in this discussion. These are very interesting and very difficult subjects. Thank you very much, Tim Wilson. Thank you very much, Claire O'Neill. Do come back soon. Thank you very much.